All right, everybody. Thank you for being here. Today is August 12th, I believe, 2021, and this is Kubernetes SIG Architecture Community Meeting. I will put up the agenda. Let's see. Never remember how to share things on here. Why is it not letting me? There it is. All right. So first up, we have Logical Han and Alana. Take it away.
Sure.
I'll leave it to you.
Anything, or are you good just to talk?
Yeah, I'm good to talk. So basically, we just wanted to bring up a potential proposal, which is to extend metric stability classes. Basically, it turns out that people are trying to delete and modify a bunch of alpha metrics. So it's turning out not to be sufficient for the kind of stability that we want. So
maybe to give a little bit of background. So we currently have two metric stability classes, alpha and stable. And there are like the number of stable metrics you can count on your hands. So the vast majority of metrics in Cube are considered alpha. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are all like alpha. Some of them have been around for, like 10 plus releases and are marked alpha. So people depend on them, but like that doesn't necessarily mean like an alpha specific deprecation policy should apply to them because they've been around for like 10 releases. But we don't really have any way to like forcibly mark them as like, well, actually, you can rely on this thing. It will continue to exist because the entire world is divided into the very small subset of these things we said are definitely stable and everything else.
And there's also like stuff like scalability relies on a certain number of metrics. And basically if those things change, then scalability tests will start failing. And I am pretty sure that not all of the metrics that the scalability tests rely on are stable. So there's that. So yeah, we're basically proposing to add additional phases to bring metric stability classes in line with feature branches or feature stages. That's one of the ideas. When we brought this up with the reliability working group, they suggested that we basically stagger the stages one behind the feature release, because it turns out that feature releases don't actually require metrics until the beta stage. So in the beta stage, you would introduce something like an alpha metric. And when a feature went GA, it would become beta. And then like maybe a release or two afterwards that has yet to be decided, it would be promoted to stable. That is kind of the rough idea that we have. And in addition to the beta stage, we are also thinking about having an internal or development metric stability class, because there are code-specific metrics which often change with the shape of the code that exists in Kubernetes. And we'd want to align with the use cases for metrics as they exist. That's basically.
Is that so? That brings up a question. So if a metric is stable, and I forgive me for not being up to date on all our policies. If a metric is stable, I guess we have to be careful about which metrics we make stable because of those sort of exactly the question you just said. If they're too detailed of instrumentation of the existing code, then they could go away. That could hamper our ability to change implementation. Is that already guidance in your
Yes.
in your documentation, or
yes.
how's that work?
Yeah, I mean, currently the ones that we have promoted to stable are basically SLOable metrics, API server request, latencies, stuff like that. Basically the stuff that people are using to determine SLOs and SLIs.
Alpha beta stable implies a progression.
It implies a progression and a certain amount of support.
I think like one of the problems right now is that like I think that the granularity between stable, which is a very, very high bar, and alpha, which is basically not a bar, like there's too much of a gap between the two. And so what keeps happening is people keep trying to remove metrics, and SIG instrumentation says, hold on, you can't remove that metric. It's been here for like 5 releases. You have to deprecate it first. And people will come back and they'll be, but it's alpha. It's like, okay, but like there are different flavors of alpha at play here. So maybe we need a better way to mark that.
Right. Okay. And then things that are in this 4th class, internal or development, those presumably have 0 deprecation policy, but also may well exist for a long time. They're sort of outside of that entire, like, don't build your dashboards and your SLOs and SLAs on these, but they maybe are useful for debugging effectively is what you're saying.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. I personally don't have any problem at first blush. Any other thoughts on that, folks?
Yeah, I mean, this would theoretically tie into enhancements potentially, since we mandate or pseudo mandate metrics at the beta stage. So there would be some impact there. Which is why we thought it was important to bring it here.
Are we going to require some graduation from, or I don't know, like beta metrics in order to the feature to go to GA or something like that?
I mean, we would have the same sort of mandates that exist today. I mean, I think it's like a soft mandate that you have a metric. But I mean, you could also have an internal metric for a feature. So those would not have to graduate.
I think generally a rule of thumb saying that when something graduates, it should have a beta metric, assuming that you want users to rely on that metric and the metric is reliable. Like, I don't think that it should necessarily be a hard rule, but I think that we should strongly encourage people to not perma alpha metrics.
Yeah. And that was what I was like trying to suggest. I mean, I'm wondering if we want to introduce something similar to no perma beta for API, so no perma alpha metric or something like that. Either you promote the metric and then within I don't know 2-3 releases to beta, or you remove it or something like that.
I think that's what that other category is for, right? Those might be permanent. Internal ones may be permanent.
Internal, yeah.
Progression, right? Yeah, let's keep those out of the progression. Yeah.
Yeah, internal, yeah, I agree. But those that we expose for users to track if something works or something like that, that is not purely for debugging.
I think we don't differentiate between those right now. So at least for me as like an end user, I would be confused because like all I see is metrics. To me, there's no difference whether they're considered internal or not. I think it's useful to have some like to be able to determine, okay, these ones have like the beta ones won't disappear tomorrow. That's good to know. And it'll also improve our documentation situation where right now, like basically none of our metrics are documented. And we can add enforcement for that, right, Han?
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea is we already have the static analysis tooling. So we can generate a list of metrics, alpha, beta. We would exempt the internal ones, but we would generate documentation for alpha, beta, and GA or stable.
I would push back against this idea of internal metrics because I think to an end user, there's no difference. And I think it will just add confusion. Like I'd yag-need it. You ain't gonna need it.
Maybe internal is not the right word, but the point is, I think what I'm hearing is that there needs to be a class of metrics that we know will never progress from
Yes.
to a GA metric, but we want
Yes.
to keep there so that we have them in troubleshooting situations. Now, the issue is the documentation, and as a user, those are all getting scraped. I'm just seeing them in my Prometheus or whatever. Can I differentiate between them? Probably not, other than through documentation.
No. We automatically generate tags for the annotations for metrics.
So as long as that's to me that works great, right? If I know as a user I should only rely on the stable ones, then or maybe beta, but be prepared for it to change, then I'm happy with it. But I don't know what we want to call them internal. But I want to be clear that there are some things that might disappear at any time, but aren't alpha in that you can expect them to eventually, hopefully, migrate to GA to stable.
So does this become like mostly a documentation issue, like where you really have to like make it clear to users, like this is what this means. This is what this means, so you can rely on them. This is like, these are the class of metrics that we think you shouldn't necessarily rely on. Like, is this mostly a documentation issue? Like, if they're already tagged?
I think both a documentation issue and maybe also just like a naming issue. So we already, in the metrics, we differentiate, like we don't call things alpha and GA, we call them alpha and stable. So maybe like beta isn't the right name for that in between stage. Maybe we want to pick a better name that indicates like it's not going to disappear on you, but it doesn't have to graduate to stable.
I was actually thinking we would change it to alpha, beta, and GA, change stable to GA so that we have parity with feature releases.
Yeah, but if we're not going to treat the middle phase as a beta, that we don't want to have things in perma beta, then I think that might be confusing.
Yeah, it seems like there are two audiences here. One is developers making changes inside Kubernetes and like enforcing or describing what's in bounds to, like, can you remove this thing? Can you add or remove labels? Like what's in bounds? And then the other audience is the end user. And so just as long as it's clear to both of those audiences what can be done or what should be expected from a metric, that seems like the most important thing. If it aligns with terms we use elsewhere, like sweet. But I tend to agree, like calling it beta and then the expectation being it lives here forever, that's weird and not something we want to encourage people to think of.
Yeah,
probably.
Definitely. No, we definitely don't want to have a perma beta. I mean, we can basically enforce that with our static analysis tooling.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's tempting to, I think, like follow the alpha, beta, GA, but I know, like we talked in SIG instrumentation about how we would actually want, like, assuming that we were planning on promoting these metrics to what we're currently calling stable, like we wouldn't do that when we promoted the feature to GA or stable. We'd wait. And so already they don't match up. So I think that using the same names is confusing. I think it's fine to call the first phase of metrics that don't have any guarantees alpha metrics, because I think that conveys the right thing. But I think that it makes sense to say, like, we have this intermediate class, which we don't have a name for yet, and we have stable, and those are different than beta and GA.
I prefer the name parity and it just describing it as lagging a release or two. But that's a personal preference.
But I think the problem is that some of them won't, like, some of them will never become stable, right?
Right, and those are not the ones that I'm talking about.
Yeah, but
so yeah, maybe it would be helpful to kind of sketch out the life cycle for, like, it sounds like there are two types of metrics we have: ones we expect to progress and ones that we expect to not progress. And then there are those two audiences. Maybe sketching out the life cycle apart from names, and then like we can think about what names would make sense.
Yeah, so in the reliability working group, the lifecycle is basically alpha metrics for the beta feature release cycle, beta metrics when the feature went GA, and then a release or two afterwards once the GA feature was notably stable, we would promote the beta feature or the beta metric to stable. And this is because features do change. And as people use the feature, even if it is stable, there are bugs, there are things that change. There are dimensions that people didn't realize were important. And these are not immediately obvious when a feature goes stable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if
is it normal? Is it normal for those changes to be reflected in existing metrics, or is it more typical for new metrics to be added to narrowly surface visibility to those?
It can be both. I mean,
yeah.
It can definitely be both.
So Han, just kind of spitballing. So I think I don't have any objections to the term alpha. It sounds like there's then a class of metrics that we consider supported, but they're not necessarily going to be unchanging, and then those unchanging ones are stable. That would be my like spitball idea for naming, rather than alpha, beta, stable, alpha, supported, stable. And we could even change alpha to something that is like not reflecting the alpha, beta, GA thing, like we call them experimental.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm agreeing with Alana that mapping it onto the alpha, beta, GA, if it's not moving through the cycle at a similar cadence, could be confusing, especially if things can stay in beta, and that perhaps like exploring other naming options would be more like, because you understand what all of these things really mean, but other people might not, and just getting a couple ideas out could be really, like on paper, might also be a good way to sort of parse through this and have like a couple proposed options so that people can kind of read them and take it in and see how much it actually makes sense.
Okay, so what's the next step here?
I think it's not the right place to actually figure out the life cycle. I think probably the next step is to just write a cap. It sounds like people are on board with increased granularity of metric stability classes, and that part seems uncontentious. So then we will just write a cap and yeah, circulate it. I think that makes the most sense. But we just wanted to make sure that no one thought this was a terrible idea, and that yeah, we wouldn't do a bunch of work and have people be like, no, this seems ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that we're generally in agreement. It's just a matter, like I like that it's nobody's like questioning whether or not we need like something to reflect. There's a large, wide gap between alpha and stable metrics as currently exists, and now we're talking about hammering out the details. So I think that's a great start.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's move on then, and we'll look forward to arguing over the cap. Awesome. Then let's start with the sub-project readouts. Do we have DIMS? Or is somebody else going to do code work?
DIMS is not here, but I can give an update.
Okay.
Let's see. Do this on the fly. This will be exciting. So the main thing we've been focusing on in code organization is dependency pruning and visibility. So there are two tools that we have been working on. One you will see running on pull requests, which gives visibility to sort of the before after of the pull request. So before this pull request, here's the state of our dependencies, how many direct dependencies, transitive dependencies, max depth of our tree, and then after this pull request, what's the state, and it diffs them so that it makes it easy when we're doing something that bumps dependencies, upgrades, to see like really obvious problems. Like, oh, well, we bumped a minor version of this thing, but it pulled in like 200 extra things. So it gives visibility to that. So we're using that when we do dependency reviews. That's been great. We're making some improvements there to kind of get more fine-grained details, but that will help us keep things from getting worse. And then the other tool is one that is letting us put sort of a spec status of dependencies we know we want to prune out, and keep us from like increasing things with links to those. And so these might be things with problematic licenses, or that aren't well maintained, or that we know like pull in a bunch of transitive things, and we want to work to reduce dependence on and eliminate. And so that tool will be sort of a ratcheting effect. We'll say like, here are the things we would like to stop depending on, and then gradually can remove our direct ties to them, and then over time remove indirect ties to them, and kind of reduce over time. Go 117 release candidate 2 is out. We're experimenting pulling that in and seeing what that does. It looks like it changed some stuff with modules, and we're going back and forth with the Go team on whether that was intentional or not. But we're hammering that out. Good org-wise, what else? I'm sure I'm forgetting things. A big effort for the 123 timeframe is to switch the build and code generation tooling from using Go path mode to using Go modules. We're doing that in pieces, kind of finding pieces of our build and code generation that don't work with modules and fixing those. The goal is to be done with that by 123, so that at whatever point Go drops Go path support, we are ready. So it's tedious and a pain, but hopefully will leave us in a better spot and let us rip out a lot of long-lived sort of hacks in our build scripts. That's all I have for code.org off the top of my head.
Was there something about the component working group shutting down and handing off a repo to SIG Arch? Or am I mixing things up here?
That did happen. I don't have the handoff.
So is that own then? Like this is I as far as I know, I don't think we own a whole hell of a lot of code, and now we own a piece of code. So is that code.org sub-project that's owning that? Who's owning that? I guess.
I don't know. I mean, the mechanics of the like component config stuff, the mechanics are API machinery because it's just loading API types and converting between them. The use of it had sort of been distributed across the component owners. So like scheduling messed with loading scheduler files, and Node messed with loading kubelet files. As far as like the consistency aspect of it, or sort of the central utility helper library stuff, like that was component config working group. I don't know if it would be code organization or API review, or if it would just sort of devolve back to individual component teams and be like, here, this mechanism is here, here's how other groups are doing it. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, it's pretty, not as far as I know, not very frequently changing code, so.
Yeah, scheduler and kubelet are the primary ones who were making use of it. kubeatom to some extent. Scheduler is making progress. Kubelet, I hadn't seen a lot of progress, and the other components haven't started using it. You can't actually start API server or the controller manager from a config file yet.
Okay, and those are prioritizing those SIGs, and who knows when that'll happen.
Right.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jordan. And I guess you're still on deck here for API review. So let's see.
All right. This is just sort of a survey. 46 API reviews completed for 122. That's a lot more than previous releases, but a fair amount of that is more issues or pull requests going through the review process. So that's good to see. It means we have visibility to things that previously were just sort of happening in one-off ways. So now you can actually look at the project board and see like, oh, here's the doc changes and validation changes and like the things that touch the API. So I don't actually know that it's a significant increase in real volume, but it's an increase in visible volume, which is, I think, a good thing. I called out are linked to a few notable API reviews that are queued up currently. So these are things targeting 123, or in the gateway case, it's out of tree, but it's queued up currently. HPA v2 is one of the last big beta to GA graduations for sort of these perma-beta APIs. So that's good to see. We're trying to get that reviewed and done early in the cycle. In-place pod vertical autoscaling is one that has been in the pipeline for a long time, and hopefully will make progress early in the cycle as well. And then the gateway API is an API that started as an experimental API under networking SIG and is looking to transition into the K8s.io namespace. So there's an API review associated with that. And then I wanted to mention a doc update. This is something we're trying to do better at when we are doing reviews, and basically anytime someone hits an issue in a pull request that the reason they hit it was because the documentation didn't help them. We're trying to follow that up with doc updates to say, like, here's how it would have been helpful to do this, so that we give people better guidance. So promoting an API version is something that people do a fair amount, and there are things you can do to help yourself and help your reviewer. And so Michelle was able to get that written up and make that documentation better guidance.
Awesome, thank you. One question here. How are things from the point of view of reviewers and approvers? Is the load comfortable, or you know, how's that process going?
I think this area tends to be very, very bursty. So for the majority of the release, there's actually not a big backlog. And then a week or two or three before code freeze, the pipeline just explodes. And so, yeah, that during the last 2 or 3 weeks, there aren't enough reviewers, approvers, and during the rest of the cycle, it's okay.
Is it reviewers and approvers, or is it just approvers, or what? Like, is there anything we should do? We're about to start a cycle, right? And,
yeah.
And is there anything we should do? Maybe we can't do anything about this cycle. Is there anything we should do so that next cycle, especially if the reviews are increasing?
Yeah.
Is there anything we can do to encourage? There's a contributor summit coming up. What is there anything? Anyway, you don't have to answer it here, but maybe you want to start thinking about if it's manageable, or if more needs to be done.
Yeah. So I mean, we've had the description of the reviewer shadow program for a while. Last release, I actually started doing that with all the reviews I did personally. So I would encourage the other API approvers to do the same thing. But I have a biweekly slot, and there are, like, I have people from different SIGs that I pull in, and that's where I do all the reviews that I do. And instead of me doing them and other people watching, we actually like round table them and take turns taking leads on them. So the things you see me commenting on, there's also, I think, Michelle from storage, and Aldo from scheduler, and this is terrible, Hawaii from API machinery. So I'm trying to pull people from different SIGs and give them exposure across SIGs, and then have them take turns taking lead on reviews. So my goal there is to build the reviewer bench. Michelle has been doing a great job. Like she catches pretty much everything I would catch. But I would like to see more of that built across SIGs. So that's what I'm doing personally. I don't know what the other reviewers are doing.
So that's an awesome process, and maybe it'd be a good idea to just write a paragraph or two on, hey, and ask the other approvers and reviewers to follow the same process, because that really will help get people up to speed.
Go ahead, Kirsten.
I would just consider, I'm not saying a deadline, but I'm saying to somehow articulate that the earlier you get your things in, the more you can guarantee that the API review is actually going to happen. Because what I see is people coming into the cycle very late, and, you know, teams wanting to review things and really doing their best. But that almost disincentivizes people from getting things in early. And I think that trying to articulate that, you know, if you get things in 4 weeks before the deadline, I mean, never gonna happen. 3 weeks before the deadline, those are going to definitely get reviewed. We can guarantee that. But if you get things in a week and a half before the deadline, we can't guarantee it. And maybe a couple of those don't get the API reviews, because there has to be an incentive for also people to getting them in early, because your timeline becomes so crunched. And even if you have more reviewers, they might not be available like at the very last minute to get through all of these. And I think trying to articulate that it's not guaranteed at a certain point, that you don't have enough time to sufficiently review it, because it's also about being able to sufficiently review things, is something to get people also thinking about. Like, you're not an on-demand reviewer who has to jump when people snap their fingers at the last minute, but you're also doing your real best effort to get them in, especially ones that come in early. And somehow communicating that at the beginning of a cycle could be really helpful to get people aware of it, because I don't necessarily think that, for better or for worse, I don't think anybody's really thinking about that, or thinking about you and the team of people that's looking at them, and maybe just articulating that would be really helpful.
So Kirsten, one of the, I think, issues that I saw with Node in the last cycle was that a lot of things that like needed API review, they were potentially in early, but they weren't actually labeled with API review, so they just got completely missed until I went through and I was like, oh, these things need API review, and then flagged them sort of late in the release cycle.
Can we make that label mandatory the way that we have the mandatory sort of like docs label, or I forget right at the moment, but there are labels where it's like you have to set it. You either have to say yes or no. And so like if you have that, like that could make people, if labeling is a problem, like.
I mean, so right now, I wouldn't make it mandatory, because the vast majority of pull requests don't require API review. Yep. So making most pull requests do a thing that is irrelevant to them probably doesn't make sense. There is a bot that comments on pull requests, but there's so many bots, people miss it, and it's hard to see.
Yeah.
So part of the problem is that the bot the bot will flag things as API changes, but sometimes it's wrong. And like I think that the API reviews don't actually get pulled in unless they have the API review label, but the bot will just label them kind API change.
Yeah, there's a per directory label that gets automatically applied by the bot, and then things that actually require API review, you have to manually opt in. I mean, on the one hand, like if you're making API changes, like presumably there was a design, and like I think PRs that just sort of show up out of the blue actually need a design and need buy-in from like the area owner. So ideally, if the sub-project leads or the SIG leads know the API review process, then they should be able to sort of help coordinate that, and like, oh, this is making API changes, we need to get this in early, we need to, once we're happy with this, we need to flag it. But I agree that should be communicated probably at the beginning of every cycle. So maybe coordinating with SIG release, when they send out the like 123 is open for development, this would be a good bullet point to include. Like, if you have API changes, here's a link to the process. The earlier you get in, the better. When you're ready for review, tag it this way and get slipstreamed in.
So this actually segues very nicely into the thing that I was going to ask, which is, I think that like for the average contributor, they might not necessarily, like a new contributor might not be able to accurately flag this, but I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to expect, say, like a sub-project owner to flag. And so I'm kind of wondering, so the thing that I was going to ask, the API review team right now is very small. And I think you mentioned Michelle earlier, like what is the process to become an API review shadow? Because that would be something that I would potentially be interested in doing for Node. And that's maybe something that we should try to recruit across vertical SIGs.
Yeah, so in the owner aliases file, there's a list of reviewers per SIG. And the process is work with the SIG leads to put the people you want to be shadows in that list for your SIG. And those should be tagged in as reviewers for the packages for that SIG's APIs. If that's not the case, then we can fix that. But basically, we want a group of people that is small enough to actually concentrate, like doing work and getting experience, but big enough that people, like if there are people in that SIG in that area who want to get experience, I would expect them to be able to be included. So probably 2 to 4-ish per SIG seems like a pretty decent target. So those aliases are what we use for the shadows per SIG. So if those are out of date, update those or work with area leads.
So
one of
in
the
summary,
things that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
In summary, the way to become a shadow is to update the owner's files to add the people who would be shadowing as API reviewers and not approvers.
Yep.
Okay.
One of the shifts that the release team made was focusing more on the SIGs instead of individual authors. And that sort of shift for the API reviewers might also be more effective. Like if you notice that, you know, like all of the node PRs, like there are a lot that are missing. Instead of, I think, chasing the individual authors, like trying to broadcast the messages to the SIGs, because they're the ones who are probably going to also be able, like every author might not know, but the SIG should know. Like the SIG leads who are managing the KEPs should be able, when they're looking at it, to say, hey, like this is going to need API review, and just kind of ensure that those labels are also accurate. So I think that, yeah, the communication is probably just going to be key on making sure that things are tagged appropriately at earlier in the cycle.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everybody. I think last item here on the agenda, Kirsten, it's you for our enhancements sub-project update. Oh, well, actually, I guess Hippie added something too, but go ahead.
So I have like more of an ad hoc presentation since now I was doing enhancements and release team, and I'm not doing release team anymore. So I'm hoping to spend more time working on enhancements. And the one thing that I think is really important is just as background, like there have been a lot of changes in the release process and the collection process and kind of the enhancements process. And like a lot of the community has been responding to it and doing all of the things that we've asked them to do. You know, like they've been compelled to do a lot of different things. And I think that going into 2022, instead of thinking of it for me like as what are we doing in 120, oh my God, what's the release? 123? 120, help, 123? 120. Okay, 123. Like it's thinking about how are we going to enter into 2022? And I think that kind of approaching the enhancements process on or enhancements on a larger level is also going to be helpful. So it's about, I think, like a theme that I'm considering is mostly how can we make it better for people in a very empathetic and proactive way. And I think that that's something that's gotten a little bit lost in process and in a lot of other, you know, busyness that people have had, where we have like big initiatives that may or may not get off of the ground and a lot of different ideas. But I think that the anchoring idea should be like, hey, like a lot of people have changed how they've done things and they've been really cooperative, but there are some smaller things that we can do to kind of make the experience better. So like people are working on a KEP website, which is something that people have been asking for, like a easy way for maybe external people to get an idea of what the KEPs are. Another person, Xander, he actually has like a pretty cool like update that he's been working on just privately to KEPCTL that has some like pretty great functionality. Just it doesn't change any process, but it's a tool that helps people kind of see the status of KEPs and milestone KEPs and everything like that. And that's great because that doesn't impose extra process. It's like really like a value add. Some of the other ideas that I've had, some of the problems that I've seen is that we're not very clear on what we expect from people in their enhancements. And there's sometimes friction and confusion that people have when they come to the repo. So like auditing the KEP instructions, are they clear? Are we really clear about what we're asking people to do? They're included in the template, so that's not necessarily completely ergonomic. And there are some points of friction in there where I've seen authors get confused over time. Another idea is asking SIGs and also architecture and other people, like, are there some canonical examples of good KEPs? Like that's a way to like reinforce values about like what we're thinking of when we say this KEP needs to be good. Like this is an example that you can also look at instead of, you know, relying on your reviewers over and over and, you know, like really sort of stating this is good to us. One thing is to stop changing the KEP template in minor ways constantly. I know that a lot of the tooling has been related to the metadata, and that's super important for tracking KEP. But the content of the KEP is also extremely important to the authors and the SIGs and everyone else. And I think that coming up with a way to version the KEP template and to have a policy of not constantly changing the template and sort of being able to articulate any changes that we make to the community, to SIGs, to reviewers is going to be like really beneficial. Because right now, I think that the communications between enhancements and the SIGs isn't great. We don't have a lot of changes right now, but in the past. And that if we can improve that, it's a little bit easier, because what's happening a lot is that people come back to enhancements maybe after like a cycle or two. You know, they're like, okay, it's time to like, I've talked to the SIG, we're definitely going to move it to beta, we're definitely going to move it to GA. They don't really know that something has changed though. And so they put a lot of work into the KEP. And then what happens? You make your PR, and then something tells you that something's wrong. Somebody reviews it later, figures out that you didn't do this thing that you were supposed to do. And it's like, it can be a basic thing of like highlighting on the README page, hey, this is what's new. Like, for example, it's not new anymore, but what's new is PRR. Like, if you don't have that, like, you really need to make sure that you have that. And that builds like a sort of like proactive awareness to somebody who's going into the repo, as well as potentially providing once we agree that KEP should be, the template could be versioned, is, you know, a diff. Because that's not actually easy. Like when people are looking at the template to say, you can say it needs to be updated, but the follow-up question is always like, to what? What do I need to update? And we don't have a great way to like demonstrate that to somebody. So these are like not necessarily like massive changes, but I think that they're ergonomic changes that would address some of the friction that I see in the day-to-day that would make people a little bit more comfortable with the enhancement process, but also allow us to kind of circulate our values. Like, why is this important? This is what we expect of you on the front end rather than the back end, because people are not as amenable to things when they're like a week before code freeze and they've worked on it and now they're finding out that they did something wrong or there were other expectations. So I think that, you know, being proactive and trying to be empathetic with authors and with the SIGs, because they've really, like, I think accommodated a lot of changes, is like, at least for me, a theme going forward in 2022. And then the other sort of major thing is I'd really like to get a conversation going with like just a work in progress process KEP template, just to kick that off, because I think that the cadence KEP was a disaster, and part of it was because we didn't have a template. And I think that the template is not about necessarily like the contents of it. It's about sharing, like a lot of this is about sharing our values and what we think is important. And for large, far-reaching changes, the most important thing is communication. It's about telling people, giving people the opportunity to reply, giving people the opportunity to know what's happening, and having that circulated like far and wide so that nobody's surprised at the last minute. And I think that if we can kind of get that conversation going and not really focused on like, when is it going to be done? Like, is it going to be perfect? But just get that idea out there because people want it. That's also going to be great going into 2022. And hopefully, you know, like sometime then we can have a template that everybody can use. But that's kind of like a theme that I'm thinking of for the whole enhancements thing, as opposed to like massive projects, just reducing friction, being empathetic, because I just see this a lot. I've seen it a lot now over like a couple of years, like dealing with the releases and trying to be a little bit more proactive so that people have a more comfortable experience with enhancements. And I think that all of that's kind of infrastructure, which will let us then, you know, if we have to make changes to the KEP, we have a great way to talk about it with people. We have a great way to document those changes. We have a great way to tell the release and the SIG leads like how to go forward with that. So I don't know, that was like a freestyle. That's where my head is at, and that's, I don't know. I hope that's
okay.
That's added.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think what would be interesting at some point would be, as you develop that theme, like some read next time, maybe a readout on like what can be done to simplify things, like specific things. That's a good theme.
Definitely.
I think everybody likes less friction in the process for sure. So if we can do more on that, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully in a meeting or two, I'll have like the official sort of official, but more actionable bullet points that, you know, are going to be worked on going into 2022. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, we have one more item on the agenda. We have about 10 minutes left. So Hippie, I believe it is you now. You are on mute.
Technology. I also wanted to make sure that we saw the notes for Kirsten's statement and make sure that we heard that and it's visible. And if I missed anything, I can tend to type and miss stuff. I would encourage you, if I'm on a call typing fast, fix my misstatements and incorrections. Thank you so much, Kirsten, for your time and effort. I love that you have a theme going forward, and I think it's lovely. For the conformance subproject, attendance on these things is very sparse. And that's okay, because it's only a few people that have the skill set so far to be able to do this. And we love to increase that, but we're also hopefully getting towards the end of filling the hole without digging the hole deeper. I think we're going to get through that probably in 125, so I don't know, somewhere in there. It's I'd love to be done by the end of next year. We'll see. But we are on target for 120. Oh, so sorry, the monthly meet. So rather than meeting every other week, let's move it to once a week. And that way, for people that is not so often, make it a priority. Show up. We'll make sure that the agenda is full of all the things. Also for 123,
right? You said once a week. I assume you mean once a month.
Well, sorry, yes, the first Wednesday of the month, once a month on that first Wednesday, which is my Thursday, and that's lovely. 123, we're going to get below 75 without conformance. That means we just have 75 more endpoints to go. That doesn't include all the things that we put on the not available for conformance. We might revisit that, but let's do that in a conformance meeting when we get closer to seeing what's left. We're at 99. We've gotten below 100. That's a pretty cool milestone. And there is an endpoint that we have lost conformance on. It happens when APIs change or somebody changed a library or a test. And so this one isn't being hit. We'll talk about that in our next conformance meeting. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts for that? Otherwise, I'll return the floor to John.
Okay, awesome. Well, that is our agenda for today. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate all the work everybody's doing. And we will see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.